All right, I'm going to do a simple little demonstration on how to use Twilight Render. Just basically opening up a SketchUp model and taking it into Twilight Render. We will edit the textures a little bit, but we won't take it anything beyond that. So this is just the most basic level of using this plugin for rendering. And I don't expect you to be able to do more than that at this point. We'll get into much more detail later on. So I've got a model here that I know will work pretty well with Twilight. Got interesting arrangement of SketchUp materials. Basically all I have to do in order to tell Twilight Render how things are supposed to behave is go into the material editor. I sample the materials. So for example, I'm going to sample the glass. And I can tell that this model has already been set up to use glass, but if it hadn't been, I would go under templates, go under glass, and then choose common. So these architectural versus realistic options, the architectural ones render much faster. They're not the same quality as you get out of the realistic ones. The realistic ones behave much more like true glass, where you've got some dimensional thickness to it. The architectural glass is just meant to render fast. So for our purposes, that's the one we typically use. So I'll choose common. I'm going to go and select this material here. Right now it's just a solid color. Very little's been done to it. So I'm going to say I want this to behave like rough stone. There is no texture applied to it at this point, or no bump, I should say. What else do we want to sample? This wood. You'll notice under the templates there's not a wood setting. So I would use, I'm thinking about the finish that would be applied to the wood. So we do have an option for satin semi-gloss or gloss, the same as what you'd find if you went and got varathane or something like that. So I'm going to say that this has a semi-gloss finish on it. So it's going to have a little bit of reflectivity. I'll also sample the palm tree, and for this I'm going to go under generic and soft reflective, just so it's got a little bit of reflectivity. We'll have to see how that behaves. With bump, I'll try using the texture. So by clicking on this link here, I'm telling it I want you to use the actual mapped photo image, similar to the material in SketchUp, to tell it what makes the bump and what doesn't. And I should check the wood and make sure that there's some bump applied, and there is. So the same thing's being done here. So it's going to read these depressed areas as low, and the other areas as raised. So it's going to try and fake some material for that. And I would keep editing all these materials. So this is kind of a stone material. I would go under my templates, stone, and I would say maybe natural for that. What's this? So there's not really anything applied to this. This gray. I'm going to say this should be a metal. You can use the brush metal settings. These take a very long time to render. So I'm going to go under fast actually, and you can see there's a fast aluminum. That's the one that I'm going to use, and that's going to give it a bit of reflectivity. And I think this texture is probably the same, but I'll just sample it. Nope, it's not. So I'm going to add the same effect to that. So I'm going to say, maybe I'll say that's painted. I'll go under generic and I'll say soft reflective. So I think that's kind of just a soft metal. And this, so it's a SketchUp material, but there's actually nothing been done to this. So I would go under my template and tell it that this should be some sort of glass. And just for the sake of being realistic, this is a frosted glass. I'm going to say this is, it's actually heavy frosted. So I keep doing that. I work my way through the model, sampling everything that's there. I could go through and sample this. This is actually using some other imported textures, so this already has a SketchUp material or a Twilight material applied to it, so I won't bother to mess around with that. and that's actually like an aggregate material. So I'm going to tell it to use the texture that's there. So use the photo, and then I'm going to tell it that I want it to behave like natural stone. Alright, so that's all of my settings that way. The other thing I might want to adjust is the time of day, because if you use the default sky light settings in Twilight Render, you're going to be using your shadow settings from SketchUp to determine what the lighting looks like. So however I set this, and my shadows actually aren't on, however I set this is how it's going to render. So I want to adjust it until I get the shadows kind of cast the way I want. That's kind of creating a dramatic shadow, so I'll leave it like that. And now if I go into the light editor, which is right here, physical sky means it's using the SketchUp settings. You can adjust the brightness. This dusty sky turbidity is kind of the pink effect that you get at the horizon. You can adjust that a little bit if you want. The other setting that's important to think about for rendering time is this sunlight setting. What this really controls is your shadows. And basically this is how soft or how hard you want the edges of the shadows to be rendered. Real shadows have very soft edges, and that would involve pushing this setting this way, but that's going to make your render time take very long. So generally, for most of our purposes, we have our settings turned down here somewhere. And you can adjust these settings. Generally you have to do a test render to see how it's going to look. So I've adjusted things. I'm going to go into Twilight now, and I'm going to choose a setting that's good for having a look at how it's going to turn out. So I'm just going to use medium, and for now I'm just going to render this at 500 by 500 pixels. I'm not going to do a big one because I don't know if it's going to look any good. So I've got my everything set up. Now I'm going to click on render, start render. This tells me I have something selected. Unless I wanted to just render that selected object, I'm going to say no. And then this is going to render. So you'll see down here, shooting photons, it's basically calculating how light's behaving. And it's basically just calculating everything. And then you're going to see it start doing the ray tracing, which it's doing now. And then it will anti-alias. The anti-alias is like the smoothing pass. That smoothens out these kind of chunky edges that you have here. So as you can see, that looks pretty good. It is of course missing entourage. It would be nice to have some entourage in there, but for the sake of this basic how to use Twilight exercise, that'll do. And that'll complete here in a second. So that's a good initial rendering. There's a lot more we can do to this that we'll learn about next semester, but for now this is good basic use of SketchUp. If I did want to use entourage in here, I'll show you what I would typically do, because what generally looks the best are the photo-based entourage options. So search for 2D people. Something that's photo-based like this, or we don't need a Celtic girl perhaps, but some of these photo-based ones, they're going to look the most realistic. Sometimes people don't like realistic entourage. They find they're distracting. So you can use silhouettes, and if they're done correctly, try this annoying hipster. Let's put him in here, and he's not scaled correctly. So let's just make him a little bigger. One thing you can do to figure out size is, put the person beside an object. We know that scale-wise that's pretty good. yeah, he looks like the kind of the annoying guy, kind of guy who would drive this Mercedes. They head down to Value Village and buy some clothes so he doesn't look so fortunate. Move him. Oh, too close. Generally, you want to place your entourage so that they're kind of leading your eye into the scene. That's kind of the best way to do it. So I don't really want to put him here in the center. Because the photo quality is not awesome, I can't bring him up to the foreground, although that's kind of a good way to use entourage. So I think I'm going to stick him back here, and this is where he'll be standing. Now, he would probably render out quite nicely, but if I didn't want a photo-based image on there, some clients don't like that, I could apply a SketchUp material. And what I find works best for creating a nice silhouette type effect is to use the translucent, I should say, this kind of gray glass material. And the trick to it is to not edit it as and make it into Twilight glass. Just leave it kind of as SketchUp glass, and you get kind of a decent effect. So I'll try that, and we'll render that out. So you can see that gives you kind of an interesting entourage effect. Yes, it's not photorealistic, but it avoids any confusion. Sometimes people don't like to see a stranger rendered in their space. So it's pretty common, especially with residential projects, to use a silhouette style of entourage. And I can see he's a little bit too tall at the moment. I'm just going to scale him a bit. Okay, so now I'm going to do my final render, and I'll stop the video at this point, but I'm going to render this out largely. So if I needed to render something that I knew I was going to print, what I would need to figure out first is what are the dimensions that my final image is going to be. So if it's going to be a 10-inch image, I have to multiply the dimension of the image, 10 inches, by the acceptable print resolution, which is 300 dots per inch. So I would say 10 inches times 300, which gives me 3000 as my width dimension. And you can see here the actual size, because it's got this aspect ratio, is 3000 by 1632. That's going to give me a rendered image that at 10 inches is going to look quite good. If I just use kind of the default settings, I would end up with something that was very poor quality. I would also choose either high if I'm rendering in the computer lab. If I have a little bit more time and it's a daytime scene, I would use exterior daytime, which is going to give you the best quality rendering. So I'm going to do my render like that, and then I'll pause the video and come back and show you the final result. But that's basically all you need to know about using Twilight Render for this point in your learning. Next semester we'll dive in more detail. But that being said, there's not that much more there. It's quite a simple application to use. So I'll render and show you the result in a second. So I've set it to exterior, and away we go. So I'll show you the finished result when it's finished. Alright, so this is what our finished render ended up coming out looking like. It took about half an hour for it to render. I actually switched from the exterior progressive render setting to just the high quality setting because it was going to take a very long time. So if you've got materials like are present on this car, you can end up with some pretty long render times. So you always kind of have to plan ahead a little bit. So your image probably won't be the same quality as this one, because you're not working with a model that's going to be as sophisticated as this. This is quite a good model that was created. Just remember to be using the skills to the level that I've taught you. So you've been working with basic 2D elements and working on composing scenes rather than modeling entire environments or buildings or things like that. So just focus on creating your perspective scenes. Don't worry about modeling your entire area. Just work on getting a couple of good perspective images produced from Twilight Render. And keep it simple. I'm not looking for masterpieces at this point. You're still just learning. So that's the end of our last video, and I'll look forward to doing more work with you in computer illustration in the winter semester. Thanks for watching.